Welcome to Loop the Loop English channel again. Have you ever noticed, and I mean really noticed, how quickly people reach for their phones the moment things get quiet?
Oh, absolutely. It's almost a reflex, isn't it?
It is. And I'm talking about us too. People who are actively seeking knowledge. You're in a waiting room, or maybe the subway doors close and the noise just dips for a
Yeah.
second.
Yep.
Or that first moment you sit down at your desk in the morning before all the chaos starts. There's this tiny momentary hush, and bam.
The device is in your hand.
Exactly. Screens lit up, feeding you something.
Yeah.
It's this continuous high-def input. It just feels like this universal habit now. It's like quiet as a vacuum, and we are absolutely desperate to fill it with, well, with anything.
Yeah.
Sound, data, anything at all.
And that reflexive action, that instant, almost involuntary flight from quiet is precisely what we're going to get into in this deep dive. Our sources really analyze this powerful, I'd almost say primal aversion we have to silence. We're going to be looking at what silence actually is, what's going on in that internal landscape that we seem to fear so much.
The one we run from.
The one we run from. And most importantly, why that fear is, well, entirely misplaced. It might even be self-sabotaging and really counterproductive if your goal is to be a curious, effective learner.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. Because the core idea from our source material is this really powerful paradox. The very thing we often say, we want peace, mental rest, a moment to just calm down and integrate what we've learned. That's the thing that causes this instantaneous, almost measurable discomfort as soon as we get it.
We feel restless.
Restless, anxious, you feel like you have to do something. So we're going to explore the cognitive reasons behind this. We'll move systematically from the symptom, that constant distraction we just talked about, to the cause.
Which is what's really going on in our heads.
Exactly. The specific, difficult, and often suppressed thoughts that bubble up. And then finally, we'll get to the surprising and incredibly specific cognitive benefits that only silence can give us. Things like, genuinely enhanced focus, more creativity, and real emotional processing that can turn this vague unease into something clear and actionable.
Right. Our whole mission here is to try and help you, the listener, transform how you see silence. It's not a void that needs filling. It's a resource that you have to actively use.
A resource. I like that.
We're going to dive deep into let's call it the architecture of quiet time. We want to understand what the brain is actually doing when it doesn't have all that external stuff to manage and why that internal work feels so much like stress.
Okay, let's start with the symptom then. This flight from quiet. It's not just a trend, is it? It's a real, observable behavioral thing.
It absolutely is.
Just think about it for a second. When was the last time you were truly somewhere silent, but not by choice, and with no pressure to be, productive? It's incredibly rare.
It is. And as soon as that external noise pollution drops off, the reflex is to generate our own internal controllable noise.
And that's the phone.
Yeah.
That constant reach for a device is driven by this deep cultural and maybe personal belief that quiet equals stagnation. Or even worse for someone in a competitive learning space, that it means inefficiency.
I think the discomfort comes from two places there. First, there's this ingrained social belief that if you look busy, you have value. If you're just sitting quietly, you must be lazy or unproductive.
Right. You're not hustling.
Exactly. And second, there's this internal calculation that if my mind isn't actively taking in new information, a new article, a business trend, a lecture, then I must be wasting precious time.
And that drives the action. The hand reaches for the phone. It's almost a self-soothing thing like, don't worry, I'm still engaged, I'm still consuming, I'm still moving forward, even if that progress is, well, totally illusory.
Yeah, and the methods we have now to maintain that state of constant engagement they're incredibly sophisticated. It's not just tuning into the radio anymore.
Not at all. We have this endless supply of highly engaging, totally personalized material. We can listen to content at 1.5 speed. We can stack deep dives like this one back to back.
Right, and we curate our feeds to make sure there is never, ever a millisecond of non-engagement.
Never a gap.
That intense curation, it leads us right to the mechanism of distraction. The source gives a very clear definition for distraction, something that takes your attention away.
Simple enough.
It is. We use music, podcasts, videos, all these endless feeds. They are all external inputs, and they're all designed to keep the mind actively occupied. But what's really critical here is to analyze how they function in the brain. What they're doing is maintaining a continuous cognitive load.
A cognitive load.
Yeah.
So if I'm getting the idea here, we are consciously choosing to put this constant controlled weight on our brain's bandwidth. And that's exhausting, but it's also weirdly comforting because it stops something worse from coming to the surface.
That is precisely it. This load is deliberately applied to prevent internal processing. We are making a calculated, often subconscious, but still a calculation choice to keep the mind busy externally, rather than letting it have the space to deal with internal and, potentially messy information.
It's a strategy.
It is. Psychologically, you could call it a cognitive displacement activity. It's an intellectualized form of fidgeting. If your mind is busy following the complex thread of a podcast about, say, historical economic collapses, it literally cannot use that same mental bandwidth to ruminate on that difficult conversation you had with your manager or the existential dread of a big deadline.
Okay, but hold on. I could challenge that a little.
Huh.
Because for a lot of people, and I'd include myself in this sometimes, having background music or some kind of familiar, not too demanding podcast on is actually necessary to get into a flow state.
Yeah.
To maintain attention on a boring task. How does the source material draw the line between using input for focus versus using it as a displacement, a shield?
That's a really important distinction, and the sources do address it. It comes down to the intention and the cognitive density of what you're listening to.
Okay, density.
Right. If the input is low density, so familiar music, white noise, repetitive soundscapes, it might actually help you focus by filtering out more distracting variable sounds in your environment. That can help the brain lock onto a repetitive task. That's often what flow is.
Okay, so that's assistive. It's a tool.
It's a tool. However, when the input is high density, a new complex deep dive, a fast-paced video, an engaging social media feed, the cognitive load is significant.
Yeah.
The brain has to spend real processing power to decode it, to integrate new facts, to manage the narrative.
And if you're trying to do that while also writing a report, you're just switching back and forth. Yeah.
You're task switching constantly, and the quality of both things diminishes. The displacement mechanism comes in when you consume something only to occupy a gap. You're often consuming content that's just challenging enough to prevent your mind from wandering inward, but not so critical that you have to actively integrate it. The purpose just becomes filling time, not actually synthesizing knowledge.
That is a really fascinating way to frame it. It's a proactive defense mechanism. The noise is this highly curated intellectual shield against yourself.
It's the highest form of intellectualized avoidance.
Wow.
And this choice, it has profound implications, especially for you, our listener, the dedicated learner. You're inherently interested in gaining knowledge, right? You want to do it quickly, but also thoroughly. You listen to deep dives like this, you read complex articles,
Right.
and that consumption is clearly valuable. But the core question the sources force us to ask is this: when does that constant content consumption count as active knowledge integration, and when does it just slide into pure avoidance?
That hits close to home. Is that constant stream of expert analysis, or even that music in the background while we work, is it truly helping our focus? Or is it just a crutch, to borrow a phrase from the source, to avoid being alone with their mind?
The purpose is everything. If you're consuming knowledge actively, you're pausing to take notes. You're synthesizing it in your head. You're debating the points with yourself. That's integration.
That's active learning.
It is. But if the consumption is just this continuous, seamless flow that you use to occupy every single second of quiet in the car, walking between meetings, on the commute while you're waiting for water to boil, It shifts. It goes from learning to a very sophisticated form of distraction. And critically, it prevents the very silence that's needed for the brain to file, organize, and consolidate the knowledge you just took in.
So the immediate reach for external input, which seems productive because, I'm listening to something smart, can actually be sabotaging the deeper cognitive work we need to do.
It can.
It keeps us in this state of perpetually managing the immediate incoming data, but never fully analyzing or embedding what we've already stored.
And that continuous external maintenance, it comes at a huge cost. The neglect of internal self-maintenance. We're optimizing for input speed, but we're sacrificing long-term retention and real depth of understanding. And that brings us right to the heart of it, why that necessary internal work feels so intensely unpleasant.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me, because we're moving from the symptom, the distraction, to the actual cause. Our sources state the core argument so clearly. It's silence gives us space to think. And that's exactly why it feels uncomfortable.
It's so direct.
It is. The very act of thinking, just left to its own devices without an external task to anchor it, is often seen as a threat. But why? Why would the very mechanism that defines us, our ability for conscious thought, for introspection, be something we actively, even desperately run from?
The answer is in the radical shift that happens when that external sensory input drops to zero. You're no longer managing sights, sounds, emails, notifications, conversation flows, all that cognitive energy that was being used for that.
It's freed up.
It's freed up, and it is immediately, non-negotiably diverted inward. When it's quiet, we hear our thoughts more clearly. And this clarity, it's not the gentle, soothing sound of meditation. It's high-definition, 8K resolution clarity. And it's directed specifically at our unresolved internal conflicts, our neglected issues, and our postponed problems.
And that clarity is the immediate visceral source of the unease. It's like flipping on the lights in a really cluttered room you've been avoiding for months.
That's a perfect analogy, and we have to define uncomfortable here. The source gives us a specific definition, causing unease or stress. The critical point is that the stress doesn't come from the silence itself. It comes from the content that the silence allows to surface.
So silence is just the amplifier.
It's the amplifier. It doesn't create the thoughts. It just strips away all the layers of sensory noise and task management that we use to suppress them. These aren't new problems showing up. They're backlog items that are demanding our immediate attention.
So the quiet forces us into this confrontation with mental items we've been actively postponing. And based on our sources, we can actually categorize these into 3 distinct, really taxing types of internal stressors that always seem to surface. Let's start by getting deep into the first one. Doubts.
Doubts. These are highly personal, often tied to our professional self-critique, and they tend to crystallize into specific fears about our capabilities or past mistakes.
Okay.
When silence descends, it gives this powerful, undistracted platform to our internal editor, that deeply self-critical voice that we all have. We start questioning our capabilities with vivid clarity. Things like, am I really good enough at this new skill I'm trying to learn? Or, was my performance in that presentation last week actually good, or did I miss a critical point?
Or even bigger ones, right? Like, should I have taken that other job offer last year?
Exactly. And this requires a tremendous amount of cognitive energy, doesn't it? Because these thoughts force the brain into what's called counterfactual thinking, the difficult process of replaying scenarios, analyzing what-ifs, assessing alternative realities.
It sounds exhausting.
It is extremely taxing. It's far more work than just processing new information. Counterfactual thinking, especially when it's tied to regret, involves more than just memory recall. It's active simulation. The brain is forced to calculate the potential costs of things you did in the past and the uncertain outcomes of future choices.
And in the noise of the day, these doubts are they're a low, manageable, vague hum in the background static.
But in the quiet, they gain immense volume and focus. They transform into these acute demands for justification or reconciliation. The silence essentially eliminates your ability to procrastinate on resolving that inner conflict.
And that demand for reconciliation, that need to justify our past decisions or address our current skills gaps, we immediately perceive that as stress. It's a deep, uncomfortable review of our own performance and self-worth, and that is emotionally draining.
It is. Now, moving on, the second category is worries. These are primarily forward-looking anxieties. They're about potential threats or the acute awareness of future difficulties that we've successfully managed to keep at arm's length.
So worries are like these low-level security alerts that are always running in the background, but they suddenly turn into a full-blown siren when the external noise stops.
That's a great way to put it. We know they're there, but we manage them by just prioritizing immediate tasks.
Right.
In our busy daily lives, these future anxieties feel manageable because we're so engaged in what's right in front of us. We soothe ourselves with what you could call temporal displacement. I'll worry about that massive deadline for next month, tomorrow, or I'll think about that financial risk next week.
But silence just deletes that time cushion entirely.
Completely. The moment the noise stops, the brain recognizes an opportunity to run its threat simulation protocols without any distraction.
It brings tomorrow's problems right into today's focus, forcing us to deal with potential crises that aren't even real yet.
Yes. And the brain, it recognizes this intense focus on potential negative outcomes as supremely stressful. It's the difference between vaguely knowing there's a problem out there and suddenly seeing the specific, detailed steps you'd need to take to manage or mitigate that threat. It demands immediate cognitive labor.
So the brain is basically running a high-stakes internal premortem analysis.
It is. And this heightened awareness of future instability is profoundly unsettling when there are no immediate external tasks to ground you or give you a sense of immediate control. We feel helpless, and that feeling is what we classify as uncomfortable.
And that brings us to the third category, which often feels like the most strenuous, multivariable mental work, unanswered questions. These are the critical life or professional dilemmas that we put in the mental freezer because they are just too hard to tackle in the middle of a busy day.
These are the big ones, the really difficult strategic questions. The decision to make a complete career pivot, the discussion about restructuring a major relationship, developing a completely new, untested strategic direction for your team or your business.
These questions haven't been answered precisely because they require such complex mental computation. You have to evaluate dozens of variables, and often there's a deep emotional commitment to significant change involved. We postpone them because they're hard, not because they're unimportant.
And the daily noise, the relentless flow of emails, meetings, content consumption, it becomes this incredibly effective and socially acceptable postponement strategy. We tell ourselves we're just too busy for deep reflection.
But silence.
Silence pulls that postponed high-stakes question right into the center of the mental workbench. It demands attention and resolution. It eliminates the comfortable possibility of any further delay. And to address a question like that, the brain has to activate its highest levels of executive function weighing conflicting evidence, simulating complex long-term outcomes, and integrating both rational analysis and emotional insight.
And the effort required for that complex mental computation, that requirement to weigh all these conflicting arguments and explore these multi-layered scenarios, that is massively cognitively taxing. And because it feels hard, because it forces this intense, deep effort towards a resolution, our immediate emotional response is to label that feeling as stressful or uneasy.
Right.
It is absolutely crucial for the learner to realize this. This discomfort isn't a sign of failure or mental weakness. It's a strong, unmistakable sign that necessary, deep, and difficult cognitive work is finally beginning.
We've fundamentally trained ourselves through modern life to believe that mental ease equals comfort and that intense mental effort in the absence of a structured external task equals stress. So when silence forces us into that confrontational thinking, the immediate learned emotional response is to classify it as uncomfortable and seek the quickest exit, which is the distraction shield. We choose the low-level predictable fatigue of managing external data over the high-level unpredictable strain of managing our internal selves.
So if we understand now that our immediate emotional response is this fight or flight from deep thinking. How do we start to reframe that discomfort? How do we see it not as a threat, but as an essential cognitive resource? We have to address this crucial insight from the sources, the one that really changes everything. But silence is not empty.
This is the pivot point for the entire deep dive. If silence isn't a void, if it's not just the absence of sound, then we have to redefine what's actually happening internally during that quiet time.
Because the misconception is that silence means doing nothing, that boredom is passive.
Yeah.
And that's what leads to grabbing the phone.
Exactly.
So what is the brain doing then? If it's not resting passively, it must be working actively. And how is this activity different from the kind of thinking we do when we're, say, actively engaged in a task?
The way to think about it is as internal resource allocation. Silence is not a passive state. It is an absolutely necessary internal processing state. The brain is shifting its resources in a fundamental way, from external management to internal synthesis.
Okay, break that down.
Let's look at the contrast. During constant sensory stimulation, the background music, the feeds, the busy office, the notifications, the vast majority of your cognitive resources, especially those tied to the sensory cortices and your filtering systems, are dedicated to managing that overwhelming external input. The brain is constantly filtering out irrelevant stuff, prioritizing sounds, integrating visual data, managing the flow of tasks.
That sounds not just exhausting, but physiologically taxing. Constant prioritizing and filtering. It keeps the whole system on high alert.
It is intensely tiring. It leads directly to attention fatigue, cognitive strain, and in the long term, higher baseline stress hormones like cortisol, simply from the effort of continuous filtering.
Wow.
So when the external input stops, the brain doesn't just shut down its processing capacity. Instead, it reallocates that freed up capacity. The filtering systems, the prioritization systems, they're all freed from external duty.
So instead of trying to make sense of the outside world, the resources get turned inward to make sense of the internal world. Yeah.
Exactly. It shifts from managing external chaos to organizing and integrating internal information. This includes all that difficult, essential work we just discussed. Resolving those doubts, filing away the day's learning, consolidating memories, and integrating fragmented pieces of knowledge.
It's real work.
It's real work. The process involves things like synaptic pruning, strengthening useful connections and weakening irrelevant ones, and memory consolidation, where short-term memories are actively translated into long-term structures in the brain.
It's the brain's maintenance cycle.
Yeah.
It's like the system has finally hit the pause external input button and can now run its essential background operating system updates, its data archival, its defragmentation process, all the stuff that's critical for optimal long-term function.
That is precisely it. Silence provides a crucial opportunity for cognitive synthesis. It allows the mind to forge these deep connections between disparate pieces of information you gather throughout the day or week. It fundamentally updates your personal mental model of the world.
And this is productive work. But because it happens internally and quietly, and because it generates that initial feeling of taxing cognitive effort, we mislabel it. We call it passive, empty, or boring.
When the truth is, the most intense, long-term productive work is happening when you feel the most bored or uneasy.
We confuse sensory rest, the absence of external input, with cognitive inactivity. We think if we're not seeing or hearing new things, we're not gaining any ground.
But the biggest gains in learning and memory consolidation are happening when the system is quiet and integrating. Without these periods of internal integration, the information we consume just remains fragmented. It's just surface-level data points instead of synthesized, useful, applicable knowledge.
So that internal resource shift is crucial for long-term knowledge retention and genuine understanding. And once we can accept that silence is an active, productive state, the benefits stop being abstract ideas and become tangible strategic gains. Okay, so if the discomfort is, like we said, the sound of necessary internal work starting, then pushing through that initial unease should yield concrete, positive outcomes that directly help a learner's performance and well-being.
It does.
Let's focus on three major constructive outcomes that come from embracing silence. And let's start with the most foundational one, which is just vital for mental clarity: processing emotions.
The source defines this as to understand and deal with feelings. And this isn't just a therapeutic concept, it's a structured, complex, internal cognitive activity. Silence is the only reliable place for genuine, focused emotional processing, because emotions, just like those big unanswered questions, require dedicated bandwidth to decode.
Okay, so what are the actual steps involved in that internal process that only silence can facilitate? Because in the noise of daily life, we tend to just skip straight to reacting.
Absolutely. The first step, which is so often missed in a busy life, is simply identification. Noise and distraction keep our emotions generalized. It's a vague feeling of unease or stress or irritation.
Right, you just feel off.
Exactly. Silence forces you to identify the specific emotion. Is this genuine anger? Is it frustration rooted in bad communication? Is it fear of inadequacy? Is it just a simple disappointment? You have to assign a specific, accurate label to the internal state.
And that act of identification, just naming it, starts the process of managing it. It turns this generalized threat into a specific, addressable item.
Exactly. The second step is acceptance without immediate judgment or suppression. In the rush of daily life, we often judge or suppress our emotions instantly. We label them bad or unproductive because they're interfering with our current task flow.
Sure.
Silence allows you to just sit with the feeling, to acknowledge its presence, and accept that it's part of your current internal state without immediately trying to change it or distract from it or fix it. This temporary, non-judgmental acceptance is vital for accessing the third and most strategic step.
Which is the analysis.
The third step, and this is critical for the learner, is analyzing its source and function. Where did this feeling come from? Was it triggered by an external event, or was it an internal interpretation based on a pre-existing doubt we talked about earlier? Silence provides the mental bandwidth to trace that emotion back to its root cause. And that transforms a generalized, overwhelming feeling into a specific, manageable piece of information that can be intellectually processed and acted upon. Without silence, emotions just remain this volatile, unanalyzed background noise that continues to drain your cognitive resources.
This means we can move from feeling generally overwhelmed to specifically understanding. Okay, I am feeling anxious because I haven't clarified the scope of that new project, and here are the three concrete logistical steps I need to take tomorrow to solve that ambiguity.
It successfully turns an emotional problem into a logistical challenge.
Precisely. And that profound clarity directly informs our second major strategic gain, which is making better, more authentic decisions. But how exactly does silence lead to demonstrably better decision-making? I mean, surely we need external information, we need advice, we need debate to make high-stakes choices. If we only sit quietly, aren't we just missing critical data?
We do need external information, but silence provides the vital internal filter for that information. It protects the decision-making process from external contamination.
Contamination.
Yeah. When we're constantly bombarded with opinions, social media pressures, urgent requests, we tend to make reactive decisions, choices based on convenience, external expectations, or just immediate emotional relief. By eliminating the pressure of external noise and distraction, silence allows you to weigh the arguments and explore the scenarios based on your own true priorities and values.
So it's about stripping away the noise of what other people think we should do or what our perceived market value demands we do, and finding the signal of our own core principles.
Yes. When we make decisions quickly, under external pressure or distraction, we often default to convenient options, or choices that align with what we perceive as short-term social success or immediate gratification. Silence enables a deeper look at long-term satisfaction and genuine alignment. It allows for the full integration of that emotional processing we just discussed. And that leads to choices that are more authentic, more robust against external criticism, and ultimately more aligned with your foundational intentions. It's the difference between a reactive decision made under pressure and a principled decision made with intention.
That makes perfect sense. It's the time when your internal compass gets to recalibrate, to make sure the direction you choose is truly your own. And that leads us perfectly into the third major game, understanding ourselves, which is, at the end of the day, the ultimate goal of the learner.
This is perhaps the ultimate long-term strategic gain. Silence is fundamentally necessary for developing self-awareness. It's a concept that's often talked about abstractly, but it relies on dedicated quiet time to actually mature.
Right? We all know self-awareness is the foundation for personal and professional growth. But how does silence facilitate it, beyond just letting us process emotions?
Well, self-awareness means understanding not just what you feel, but why you value certain goals over others. It's about knowing what your non-negotiables are. If you don't have clarity on your own deepest values and true intentions, then every decision, every learning goal, every professional choice will inevitably be overly influenced by external input.
By the loudest voice in the room.
By the loudest voice in the room, the most aggressive competitor, or the most compelling headline. Silence is the dedicated time when we can clarify those values, unmasked by the input and expectations of others. It helps us distinguish between the goals we adopted from our culture and the goals we truly own.
So it's the essential, unguarded conversation with yourself, where you can truly define what success means to you, rather than what the culture or your peer group defines it as. And that clarity is what powers sustained, intrinsic motivation. It allows you, the learner, to apply new knowledge effectively because you know precisely why you're pursuing it and how it fits into your long-term map.
Without this dedicated quiet time, self-knowledge stays superficial. It's based on recent successes or failures, and your personal growth remains externally driven. You're just responding to stimuli. Silence transforms that internal chaos, the doubts, the worries, into organized, actionable self-knowledge. And that is the definition of true personal power and control over your own trajectory.
Okay, so the strategic gains we've discussed, emotional clarity, better decision-making, deep self-awareness, they're really compelling on a philosophical level. But the source material also gives us some practical empirical support. And that's often what a learner needs to justify investing time in something in today's, hyper busy world.
Right, the hard data.
The hard data. The source explicitly states that some studies show that spending a few minutes in silence each day improves focus and creativity.
This is critical, actionable data. It immediately elevates silence from some kind of nebulous spiritual practice to a quantifiable cognitive enhancement tool.
And what I love is the feasibility of it. A few minutes, not hours.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It makes the practice highly actionable for the busy professional or student who already feels totally constrained by time. You don't need a 2-week meditation retreat to start seeing benefits. You need a 5-minute cognitive break, deliberately scheduled every day.
So let's analyze the cognitive mechanisms behind that claim. How does silence, even in these short bursts, say 5 to 10 minutes, how does that lead to quantifiable, improved focus?
It directly addresses something called attention fatigue. We touched on this earlier, but it's really worth getting into the details. Our brains are incredibly sensitive organs, but they were not designed for the constant sensory bombardment of modern life.
Right.
Every notification, every sound, every visual change demands a tiny micro adjustment of our attentional system. Every single time we task switch, even just moving from a document to an email notification, we incur a cost. It's often called an attention tax.
An attention tax.
Yeah. And over time, this chronic sensory load leads to the exhaustion of our filtering and focusing mechanisms. You can think of the attention system as a finely tuned muscle that just gets strained through constant overuse and task switching.
So silence provides a systemic clean break, a genuine moment of recovery for that muscle.
Exactly. It allows the attentional systems to recover from that sensory overload and the cost of task switching. Studies show that even a brief period of non-stimulation allows the brain's filtering mechanisms, the ones designed to manage the external environment, to just stand down.
And that recovery period is essential.
It is. When you return to active work after just a few minutes of quiet, you are starting with a measurably refreshed capacity for sustained concentration. The immediate short-term benefits come from the speed of the nervous system's recovery from this constant attentional blinking or microswitching.
It's like clearing the cache on your computer's operating system. All the mental processes run faster and more efficiently afterward. This completely reframes silence. The time you spend in silence isn't procrastination or a luxury. It's essential maintenance that's required to make sure your subsequent work is high quality.
Precisely. You are investing minutes now to save hours of inefficient, distracted work later. Now let's turn to creativity. This is perhaps a more surprising link for a lot of people because we often associate creativity with high-energy brainstorming or collaboration or external inputs like visiting a museum. Yet silence is shown to measurably improve it.
Okay, so what's the precise mechanism for improved creativity? How does that work?
It centers entirely on the concept of divergent thinking and the activation of the brain's default mode network, or DMN. This is a crucial concept for any learner to grasp.
Okay.
When we are actively engaged in goal-oriented tasks, writing an email, balancing a spreadsheet, following sequential instructions, we are operating primarily in the brain's executive control network, or ECN. This network is focused, it's sequential, highly selective, and goal-driven. It suppresses anything that's irrelevant to the immediate task.
But creativity requires these lateral leaps, connecting seemingly unrelated ideas. It sounds like the ECN would actively block those leaps.
It does. Creativity thrives on divergent thinking, generating a broad spectrum of possible, non-obvious solutions. When you temporarily suppress goal-oriented tasks and external input, which is exactly what happens during silence, the brain shifts its activity away from the ECN and naturally engages the default mode network.
DMN.
The DMN. It's this massive, interconnected system that's responsible for introspection, autobiographical memory, perspective thinking, which is simulating future scenarios, and most critically for this discussion, free association.
So the quiet time is actually the brain's powerful imagination and idea association engine turning on. It's the time when two distant facts stored in different parts of your mental library finally bump into each other.
It is the internal association engine running wild, but in a constructive way. Because the DMN is not focused on a singular, immediate external goal, it can freely roam. It connects distant memories, it synthesizes recent information with old foundational knowledge, and it generates novel solutions out of this accidental, open-ended thought process.
That's fascinating.
Many historical breakthroughs, from Archimedes' eureka moment in the bath to countless modern scientific solutions, they occurred not while the person was struggling at their desk, but while they were quiet, disengaged, or performing some mundane, non-goal-oriented task.
That reframes silence entirely for our listener. It's not just a break. It's a necessary input for high-level learning and high-quality creation. Without scheduled quiet, the brain never gets out of that executive control mode, and the possibility of a genuinely novel solution just shrinks dramatically.
Absolutely. For the learner, this is the most critical takeaway. You spend massive amounts of time gathering complex knowledge. Silence is the required consolidation time to ensure that that knowledge gets integrated deeply into the existing structures of your mind. By scheduling those few minutes of quiet, treating the DMN activation like a scheduled necessity, you are maximizing the return on investment of all the complex information you've consumed. You are allowing the brain to be brilliant, accidentally.
It transforms the initial feeling of discomfort, that sound of the DMN shifting into high gear to process the backlog. It transforms that into an indicator that valuable, deep cognitive work is underway. You should learn to lean into that discomfort, knowing it signals progress, not paralysis.
We have to replace the reflexive action of distraction with the deliberate action of choosing quiet.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this entire deep dive on why silence makes us so uncomfortable. We started by noticing this immediate reflexive avoidance of quiet, usually by grabbing a phone or demanding some continuous input.
Hmm.
And we learned that the initial discomfort of silence is simply the sound of incredibly important internal work beginning. It's a confrontation with necessary, unresolved internal stressors. Our doubts about our capabilities, our worries about future threats, and our biggest, most complex unanswered questions.
And we established that avoiding that confrontation by maintaining constant external distraction means we are sacrificing essential cognitive functions. Things like the ability to process and neutralize emotions effectively, the opportunity to make truly authentic decisions that align with our values, the time required to build deep, resilient
And
self-awareness,
the strategic gains.
and the strategic gains of demonstrably improved focus and divergent creative output. Silence is not empty. It is the time the brain dedicates to crucial internal synthesis, memory consolidation, and high-level systemic maintenance, all via the default mode network.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, right now, today? It means that moment of quiet, the stalled elevator, the brief walk between meetings, the 5 minutes before you go to bed, is not a void to be filled. It's a valuable resource to be utilized.
Hmm.
So we want to pose the provocative reflection question from the source material directly to you, and we ask you to answer it honestly. When was the last time you sat in silence? Without your phone, without a book, without background music, just you and your thoughts.
We really encourage you to schedule those few minutes of quiet into your routine. Treat it as seriously as you treat a meeting or a critical work task. Do the hard internal work. Embrace that initial discomfort, knowing that clarity, self-knowledge, and profound cognitive power are waiting for you on the other side.
Next time, we'll be exploring the psychological layers behind a slightly different but equally pervasive human aversion. Why people fear failure more than they fear unhappiness, and what that tells us about how we set our goals.